The pen hovered just a breath above the paper. Across the polished mahogany table of a Hudson Yards penthouse, billionaire Sterling Thorne's hand shook so badly the ink threatened to ruin his own signature. His $10,000 suit was perfect, but his face wasn't. Sweat gathered at his temples as he prepared to sign away a 30-year legacy. Around him, high-priced lawyers sat like vultures, their eyes fixed on the document as if it were a coffin lid they were finally ready to close. Then a voice broke the expensive silence. "Sir, if you sign that, you aren't just filing for bankruptcy, you're committing financial suicide." The head lawyer snapped. "This is a private meeting. Get out." But Sterling Thorne didn't move. He stared at the waitress, Cassia Vance, whose fingers were still damp from the service kitchen, but whose eyes were locked on Clause 22C, like she had just seen a ghost. Cassia wasn't just a waitress. She was a Wharton dropout who knew exactly how a poison pill worked. In that silence, Sterling realized that one tiny error, one hidden line, was about to decide whether he lost everything or whether a billion-dollar truth was about to explode. Before we reveal the secret Cassia found in that document, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe that a sharp mind is worth more than a title, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next revelation.
The air in the Hudson Yards penthouse was so thin it felt expensive. Outside, the skyline of Manhattan shimmered under a cold, relentless sun, with the vessel looking like a giant's honeycomb beneath them. For Sterling Thorne, the view was no longer a trophy, it was a taunt. For 30 years, the name Thorne Aegis had meant American stability, innovation, and power. He had built a logistics and green tech empire from nothing, not inherited wealth, but sleepless nights and a stubborn refusal to fail. But today, the silence in the room was a painful crawl. Sterling leaned back, closing his eyes as the voices of the last 6 months echoed in his mind. Your credit line is frozen. We're pulling out of the partnership. The interest rates have shifted. Across the mahogany table sat 3 lawyers in charcoal suits. Their faces were controlled, professional masks, but they couldn't fully hide the predatory tension. They weren't just filing for bankruptcy. They were officiating a funeral. In the corner of the room, standing near a tray of untouched baccarat crystal, was Cassia Vance. To the lawyers, she was invisible, just a service worker in an obsidian-colored uniform. They didn't see the way her eyes scanned the room with a machine-like precision. They didn't know that 3 years ago, Cassia had been the top student at Wharton, a girl who saw patterns where others saw chaos. She hadn't left the Ivy League because she couldn't handle the math. She left because life happened. When her father's illness drained their savings, school fees didn't wait for courage, and Cassia traded her textbooks for a waitress uniform. Still, the habit of noticing never left her. As she stepped forward to clear the coffee carafes, the documents were spread wide, right at her eye level. Her heart skipped. She didn't see legal jargon. She saw a poison pill. "Mr. Thorne," the lead lawyer, Pierce Beaumont, said softly, "once you sign, we'll file. This protects you from further claims." Sterling's hand hovered over the signature line. The pen was a gold-nibbed weight that felt like a mountain. He thought of his parents, his father, who believed his son would never bow to anyone, and felt a hot, sharp bitterness. He was ready to surrender. "Stop," a voice whispered. The lawyers snapped their heads toward the corner. Pierce Beaumont's eyes narrowed with elitist fury. "This is a private meeting. Get out." But Cassia didn't move. She stepped into the light, her voice trembling but firm. "Sir, Clause 22C. It says your debt from the offshore acquisitions is being consolidated as immediate and total." She pointed a damp finger toward the page. "But those liabilities were phased. They don't legally transfer to Thorne Aegis for another 4 months. If you sign this, you're admitting to a debt that doesn't belong to you yet." The room went sterile.
Sterling Thorne looked at the waitress, then at his lawyers, whose faces had gone from professional to panicked. For the first time in weeks, someone in the room sounded certain. "I want that clause reviewed," Sterling said, his voice regaining its edge. Pierce Beaumont hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Sir, with all respect, she was serving coffee 5 minutes ago. And she saw something you didn't, or something you chose not to." Cassia stood her ground, her fingers twisting together. She knew she might have just ruined her job, but her father's voice echoed in her head. "Numbers don't lie. If you understand them, they'll protect you." She had spent years feeling invisible, but in this highbrow glass tower, the Wharton dropout had just fired the first shot in a billion-dollar war.
The elevator ride down to the service corridor felt like a descent into a different world. Cassia Vance stood in the corner of the brushed steel lift, her reflection staring back at her, a waitress in a wrinkled obsidian uniform who had just committed professional suicide. Her manager, a man whose anxiety was as palpable as the smell of stale espresso on his breath, paced the small space. He didn't look at her. He looked at his shoes, his mouth moving in a silent rehearsal of a firing speech. He was terrified that her interruption of the Thorne Aegis board would cost the catering firm their most lucrative contract in Manhattan. "You crossed a line, Cassia," he finally hissed as the doors slid open to the windowless basement. "People like us don't have opinions in rooms like those. We have trays and we have silence." Cassia didn't answer. She walked to her locker, her hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline of the penthouse began to fade. She thought of the Chapter 11 document and the predatory eyes of Pierce Beaumont. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of the hospital administrators who had hollowed out her family's savings while her father lay in a sterile bed. To men like that, people like Cassia and her father weren't humans. They were assets to be liquidated or liabilities to be consolidated. She was halfway through changing out of her uniform when the locker room door swung open with a violent clang. It wasn't the manager. It was a man in a charcoal suit, one of Sterling Thorne's junior associates. "Cassia Vance?" the man asked, his breathing shallow from the stairs. "Mr. Thorne wants you back upstairs, now." The walk back to the penthouse felt different. The building no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like a trap. When the elevator doors opened back onto the top floor, the atmosphere had shifted from a funeral to a forensic crime scene. The glass-walled room was now littered with open laptops, half-empty coffee cups, and stacks of original acquisition documents that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Sterling Thorne was standing by the window, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, a gesture that signaled he was preparing for impact. He didn't look at his lawyers. He looked at Cassia. "Sit," Sterling commanded, pointing not to a chair in the corner, but to the seat directly beside him. "The lawyers tell me Clause 22C is an interpretation. I want to hear your logic again, Wharton, and this time, don't hold back." Cassia sat, her fingers steadying as they touched the cool mahogany of the table. She opened the file. The eyes of every powerful man in the room were on her, some curious, some dismissive, and some, like Pierce Beaumont's, were predatory. "The debt from the offshore green tech acquisition," Cassia began, her voice gaining the firm certainty she had once used in Wharton's lecture halls. "It was structured with deferred liability because the European partners retained partial operational control. In every textbook and every precedent in Manhattan, that means shared exposure. But here, the accountants have bundled it as immediate and total. It inflates your company's liability on paper by exactly 40%. A financial analyst at the end of the table tapped furiously on his keyboard. After a minute of silence that felt like a painful crawl, he looked up, his face pale. "She's right.
If we separate these, the solvency ratio changes completely. We aren't bankrupt, Mr. Thorne. We're being manipulated." The room went cold. Sterling Thorne turned to his CFO, Pierce Beaumont. "You signed off on this structure, Pierce. You told me it was airtight." Pierce didn't flinch. He adjusted his silk tie, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Thorne, you're choosing to trust the instinct of an outsider over a decade of executive loyalty. Corporate finance isn't as simple as a classroom example." "It is that simple when someone tries to hide a pattern," Sterling replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Cassia watched the two men, realizing that she hadn't just found an error, she had exposed a system of orchestration. Victor, the CFO in the model, or Pierce in hers, hadn't been trying to save the company. He had been optimizing it for himself, preparing to buy the liquidated assets for pennies on the dollar once the bankruptcy was finalized. "People like you don't belong washing dishes forever," Sterling said, ignoring the lawyers and the noise of the city outside. "I'm launching a full internal audit, and I want you to lead it, not as a waitress, but as my eyes." Cassia felt a surge of dangerous hope. She thought of her father and the school fees that had been a closed door. She looked at the signature line on the document, the one that almost ended Sterling's life, and realized that she was no longer invisible. The waitress from Wharton was now the only thing standing between a billionaire and his destruction.
The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came through the sterile silence of the HR department and the unreadable expressions of those who had held power for too long. By Monday morning, Cassia Vance no longer felt like a guest in the glass tower of Hudson Yards. She felt like a target. The inner circle had become a cage of whispers. As she walked toward Conference Room C, her shoulders straight and her steps certain, she could feel the eyes of the permanent staff boring into her back. In the world of Thorne Aegis, information traveled faster than the high-speed elevators. People spoke in hushed tones about the waitress who had derailed a 30-year legacy. Some were curious, but most were irritated or afraid. Cassia told herself not to apologize with her posture. She carried a leather-bound folder close to her chest, containing the first results of the audit, a trail of numbers that told a story of mismanagement and orchestration. The air in the conference room was thick with a tension that felt like a dropped plate. Sterling Thorne stood at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on a tablet. Across from him sat Pierce Beaumont, the CFO, looking trusted and untouchable. Pierce had been with Sterling for 12 years, a man whose sharp cheekbones and calm demeanor had navigated the company through every previous crisis. "We need to discuss the Southern Corridor expansion losses," Sterling said, his voice a low vibration. Pierce nodded smoothly, his fingers tented. "We've already addressed those in the restructuring proposal. We're consolidating them under long-term debt to simplify the picture for our creditors." "Simplifies for who?" asked Sterling, finally looking up. "For everyone," Pierce replied evenly. Cassia cleared her throat. The sound was loud in the room. Sterling turned to her, gesturing for her to speak. Pierce's eyes flicked toward her, a brief, assessing glance that carried the sting of 1,000 insults. "The Southern Corridor losses aren't operational," Cassia began, her voice gaining the firm certainty of a Wharton scholar. "They're tied to a one-time regulatory shutdown. That makes them extraordinary expenses, not recurring ones. By hiding them in long-term debt, you're creating an artificial pattern of failure." Pierce smiled thinly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "With respect, that's an interpretation. Corporate finance isn't as simple as your textbooks, Miss Vance." "It is that simple when someone tries to hide a pattern," Sterling interrupted, his voice hardening. "Are you suggesting something about my integrity?" Pierce asked, straightening his silk tie. "I'm questioning your numbers, and lately they've been wrong." The confrontation escalated quickly. Pierce stood, his chair scraping against the floor with a jagged sound. "I won't sit here and be undermined," he spat, his calm facade finally cracking into elitist fury, "especially by someone who was serving coffee last week." The words stung. They landed on every late night of study Cassia had endured before her life was interrupted. They landed on every job interview that ended because her resume was hollowed out by her father's tragedy. But before she could speak, Sterling did. "She's here because she sees what you don't, or what you chose not to." "This is ridiculous," Pierce scoffed, gathering his belongings. "If this is about trusting outsiders over your own executives, then you've already lost." He turned toward the door, stopping only for a moment to deliver a final cold warning. "You'll regret this." The door closed softly behind him, but the vibration of his exit remained. Cassia exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as the adrenaline ebbed. "I didn't mean to cause—" "You didn't cause anything," Sterling said firmly. "You exposed it." But the retaliation was only beginning. Within an hour, anonymous emails began circulating through the building, leaking Cassia's background and questioning her credentials. "Is the company really being guided by a former waitress?" one headline read in the internal chat. As Cassia left the building that evening, the city lights felt different, not kinder, but more possible. She checked a message from her younger brother. "Did something good happen today? You sound different." She smiled softly and typed back, "Yes, something honest, but honesty comes with a price." She knew Pierce Beaumont wouldn't go quietly. He was going to war, and the battle for the truth was about to become a digital storm.
The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came through the blue light of a smartphone screen in a dark room. By Tuesday morning, the unreadable expressions of the executive floor had turned into a public execution. Pierce Beaumont hadn't just left peacefully, he had gone to war. Cassia Vance woke to a barrage of notifications. A headline from a notorious New York tabloid was already trending. "Waitress at the wheel. Is Thorne Aegis being guided by a college dropout?" The article was brutal, filled with half-truths. It didn't mention her Wharton GPA or her machine-like precision with numbers. Instead, it focused on her faded uniform and her father's bankruptcy, framing her presence in the penthouse as a publicity stunt, or worse, a sign that Sterling Thorne had lost control. When she arrived at Hudson Yards, the whispers were sharper than before. She overheard them in the glass-walled corridors. "She's dragging us down. This is way above her level." The words followed her like shadows, stinging more than she expected. She found Sterling in his office, staring at a printed email from one of the company's oldest creditors. "They're reconsidering their position," Sterling said, his voice a low vibration of exhaustion. "Concerns about internal instability. Pierce is telling them what scares them most," Cassia replied, her voice trembling but firm. "Which is uncertainty," Sterling finished. The digital pressure was relentless. An anonymous email circulated internally. "Is our pension fund safe with a server calling the shots?" It was a system of orchestration designed to make transparency look like chaos. People fear what they don't understand, and Pierce Beaumont was counting on the board getting tired and backing down. "Do you want me to shut this down?" Sterling asked, studying her. "One announcement and it stops." Cassia thought about her father, a man who believed numbers don't lie, even when the world lied to him. She thought about how many times she had been invisible. "No," she said, her resolve hardening. "If they're going to judge me, let them judge me for what I do, not where I started." Cassia's father spent his last days believing his daughter's future was a closed door because of his own debt. Now she is risking everything to prove that your past doesn't define your value. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated because of your job title? I want to read your stories below. And if you believe that integrity is more valuable than a billionaire's haughty arrogance, hit subscribe to see if Cassia survives the board's final judgment. That afternoon, the board meeting was called. No delay, no preparation time, just pressure. The boardroom was a place of long polished tables and high-backed chairs where past executives watched like silent judges. Sterling, a board member cleared his throat. We've received troubling information. Your financials are being restated, and now we're told a junior consultant is influencing major decisions. Cassia's stomach tightened, but Sterling's voice was steady. She's not junior, she's accurate. Show them, Sterling commanded, turning toward her. Cassia stood. Her legs felt unsteady for the first step, then she was grounded. She didn't use jargon, she used clarity. She walked them through the deferred liabilities and the bundled debts that had been hidden in plain sight. The room grew thinking quiet. If this is correct, a woman at the far end studied the screen. It is, Cassia said gently, and it doesn't make the situation worse, it makes it honest. By the end of the meeting, the board didn't applaud, but they approved an independent audit. It was the most dangerous and hopeful decision they could make. As Cassia rode the bus home that night, watching the neon signs blurring into streaks of light, she realized that honesty comes with a price, and Pierce Beaumont was already preparing the bill.
The next morning, the digital storm had settled into a heavy, cold fog of legal reality. Cassia Vance arrived at Hudson Yards to find a crisp white envelope with a prestigious Century City law firm letterhead sitting on the mahogany desk. It wasn't a Chapter 11 filing this time. It was an invitation to a private settlement meeting in a glass-walled office that felt more like a coffin lid than a boardroom. The room sat high above the city, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, making the Manhattan skyline look like a toy beneath their feet. Sterling Thorne stood by the window, his jacket off and sleeves rolled up, looking like a man who had fought the night and lost. Across the table sat Pierce Beaumont's legal team, two high-powered attorneys in sharp gray suits who watched Cassia enter with predatory fake smiles. "Miss Vance," the lead lawyer began, his voice as smooth as oil and salt water, "we've reviewed your findings. While we maintain that your interpretation of the debt is flawed, Mr. Beaumont wishes to avoid further internal instability. He's prepared to offer a gesture of goodwill." He slid a document across the polished mahogany table. Cassia's eyes locked onto the figure printed in bold, $50,000. It was a special educational scholarship granted in exchange for her immediate resignation and a confidentiality agreement. The pen hovered just a breath above the paper. To Cassia, that $50,000 wasn't just a number, it was the closed door to her future being forced open. It was the medical bills that had hollowed her out, the tuition she couldn't afford, and the oversized shoes stuffed with tissues she had worn for years. "This protects you, Cassia," the lawyer said gently, using the same haughty arrogance that had nearly destroyed Sterling. "It ensures you never have to serve another cup of coffee." Sterling Thorne didn't move. He watched Cassia with an expression that was half angry, half desperate, because for the first time in weeks he didn't know if his eyes were for sale. Cassia looked at the check, then at the glass tower around her. She thought of her father, sitting at the kitchen table, telling her that numbers don't lie. If she took this money, she would be trusting the wrong voices just like Sterling had. "My father died believing that truth was the only thing that couldn't be liquidated," Cassia said, her voice trembling but firm. She pushed the check back across the table. "I'm not a junior consultant you can buy off," Cassia continued, her gaze unbreakable. I'm a Wharton dropout who knows exactly what this is. This isn't a scholarship, it's a bribe to keep Clause 22C in the shadows. And my silence isn't for sale." The lawyer's smiles vanished. The room became sterile and quiet. Sterling Thorne stood up, a tired, honest smile breaking across his face for the first time in months. "The meeting is over," Sterling said, gesturing toward the door. "And Pierce Beaumont should know one thing. We aren't backing down. We're going to the hearing." As Cassia and Sterling walked out of the massive glass skyscraper, silhouetted against the bright sun, they held their ground. They were holding hands tightly in spirit, two people who had decided that honesty comes with a price, and they were finally ready to pay it.
The morning of the federal hearing arrived with a sky the color of dull silver. The air outside the regulatory building was cold and sterile, smelling of dust and ink, as Cassia Vance stood before the massive stone pillars. This was no longer a private meeting in a glass penthouse. This was a moral examination conducted in the light of day. The hearing room was a place of long, polished tables and high-backed chairs, with a panel of 3 stern officials sitting like silent judges. Around the room, journalists and observers sat in thinking quiet, their eyes flicking between Sterling Thorne, the Grammy-winning titan of industry, and Cassia, the young woman who had once been invisible. Pierce Beaumont sat at a separate table, his face a controlled professional mask. He didn't look at Cassia. He stared at his own tablet, his sharp cheekbones illuminated by the glow of the screen. He still believed that loyalty meant silence, and that corporate finance wasn't as simple as textbooks. "This review concerns financial disclosures and governance practices at Thorne Aegis," the lead regulator began, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. The interrogation was relentless. They started with Sterling, questioning his oversight and his responsibility for the bundled liabilities that had nearly liquidated his legacy. Sterling answered plainly, with no defensiveness or haughty arrogance. Then the regulator turned to the raw evidence. "Miss Vance," the regulator said, gesturing toward the witness stand, "explain the system of orchestration you uncovered." Cassia stood. Her legs felt unsteady for the first step, then grounded as she approached the microphone. She connected her laptop to the massive screen, displaying the recalculated numbers and the patterns that had been hidden in plain sight. "I won't take much of your time," Cassia began, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll just show you what was buried beneath layers of intercompany transfers." She walked them through Clause 22C and the deferred liabilities that had been inflated aggressively to make Thorne Aegis look high risk. She showed them the vendor contracts that led to shell companies and the maintenance fees for facilities that had been shut down. "This wasn't mismanagement," Cassia said, her gaze unbreakable as she looked directly at Pierce Beaumont. "It was orchestration. It was a system designed to siphon money in circles until there was nothing left for the founder." A murmur rippled through the room. One official leaned forward. "Why wasn't this identified earlier?" "Because transparency wasn't prioritized," Cassia replied gently, "and because people like Pierce Beaumont counted on uncertainty, making the board run back to familiar lies." The hearing stretched on for hours, a painful crawl through dates, terms, and consequences. Finally, the lead regulator closed her notebook. "We have reviewed the expanded audit and the governance changes," she said, her voice echoing in the sterile room. "Adabio Global, Thorne Aegis, made serious mistakes, but you confronted them directly, without deflection or delay." The verdict was a sharp shift in power. Pierce Beaumont's access was revoked, and his accounts frozen pending a criminal investigation into fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The bankruptcy document that once was a coffin lid was torn in half. As Cassia walked out of the building, the press swarmed. A reporter shouted, "Did the waitress really save the billionaire?" Cassia stopped and faced the cameras. "I didn't save anything alone," she said calmly. "I just refused to stay invisible.
I refused to ignore what I saw. That evening, as she rode the bus home, her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages of gratitude and recognition. She had crossed the line and exchanged invisibility for responsibility, and for the first time in years, honesty felt possible.
The morning after the hearing arrived with a sky the color of wide open blue, stretching over the city like a held breath finally released. At Thorne Aegis, the air had changed. It no longer smelled of dust and ink, but of shared ownership and relief. Cassia Vance walked into the Hudson Yards lobby, her shoulders straighter and her steps more certain. She wasn't carrying a coffee tray. She was carrying a slim folder containing the future of the company. Sterling Thorne was already in his office, but he wasn't staring at the skyline in defeat. He was packing slowly, clearing out the framed magazine covers and awards he no longer cared about. He looked at Cassia and smiled, a tired, honest one. "I thought this room made me who I was," Sterling said, looking at the glass walls. "It only showed you who you thought you needed to be," Cassia replied softly. Sterling handed her a document. It wasn't a consulting contract or a bribe. It was a transition structure for a new oversight council. "I want you to chair this," he said, "not to lead forever, but to make sure the system holds." Cassia looked at the offer, then at the city below. "I'll do it," she said, "on one condition. I finish my education. I won't keep fixing systems I was forced out of learning." Cassia started this journey as a shadow in a black uniform, but she ended it as the conscience of $1 billion empire. She proved that truth doesn't belong to the powerful, and hope doesn't belong only to those who are already winning. Tell me in the comments, if you found a mistake that could save a life but cost you your job, would you have the courage to speak up? If Cassia's journey moved you, hit subscribe so we can keep telling stories that remind us of the power of being human. Her first day back at the Wharton School felt stranger than any board meeting. She sat in a lecture hall filled with younger faces, feeling older and heavier with responsibility. But when the professor began speaking about financial ethics, Cassia didn't just take notes, she leaned forward. She wasn't there to dream with her head in the clouds. She was there to finish. At the office, the whispers had been replaced by a new rhythm. A junior analyst stopped her in the hallway one afternoon, his voice nervous but proud. "I pointed out an inconsistency in a report last week," he said. "My manager listened." Cassia smiled, knowing that this was the real victory, not survival, but courage becoming ordinary. That evening, Cassia returned to the small balcony of her apartment. Her mother sat beside her, eyes shining with a pride that money couldn't buy. "You didn't just change a company," her mother said softly. "You changed what you believed you were allowed to be." Cassia looked out at the flickering city lights. She thought about the pen hovering, the waitress uniform folded away, and the choice to speak. She realized that the hardest part of telling the truth wasn't the risk. It was accepting that once you do, it changes you and you can't go back. But as she opened a new audit report sent from Sterling, her brow furrowed. She saw something, a small buried pattern in a different department, a transaction that didn't fit. She didn't panic. She smiled. Somewhere in the city, another pen was hovering, and another quiet one was watching from the shadows. The war for Thorne Aegis was won, but the war for the truth was just beginning. Cassia picked up her phone and dialed Sterling's private line. "Sterling," she said, her voice clear and unbreakable, "we need to look again."